December 7, 1941. A date that lives in infamy. For the United States, it was a day of shock, tragedy, and a sudden, violent entry into a global conflict. But for the Empire of Japan, it was the dawn of what felt like an unstoppable new era. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was a stunning military success. The Imperial Japanese Navy had done the impossible, had crippled the heart of the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a single, audacious strike. As battleships burned and American airfields lay in ruins, a wave of what historians now call strategic euphoria swept through Japan's military leadership. This wasn't just a victory. It was proof that their bold, aggressive strategy could redraw the map of the Pacific. In the months that followed, this confidence surged into a tidal wave of conquest. From December 1941 to May 1942, Japanese forces stormed across the Asia-Pacific. Hong Kong fell, then Malaya, and the fortress of Singapore. The resource-rich Dutch East Indies, Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines all were swiftly captured. Each victory was another headline, another confirmation that Japan was destined to forge its greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Tempaya was expanding at a pace never before seen in its history, creating a powerful sense of unstoppable momentum. Within the Japanese high command, a dangerous belief began to take root. They saw the United States not as a sleeping giant, but as a nation lacking the will to fight a long, brutal war across thousands of miles of ocean. Propaganda portrayed Americans as soft, materialistic, and unwilling to make real sacrifices, while Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, privately worried that Japan could only hold its advantage for 6 months to a year before America's industrial might turn the tide. His cautious voice was drowned out. The more dominant opinion was that the knockout blow had already been delivered. The war, they believed, was practically won. This overconfidence profoundly shaped Japan's next moves. Strategic decisions were increasingly based on optimism rather than a sober assessment of reality. Japanese commanders critically underestimated the sheer scale of American industrial capacity, even as they celebrated their victories. Factories across the U.S. were already retooling, preparing to churn out ships, aircraft, and weapons at a rate the world had never seen. They also misjudged the American people. Far from breaking their spirit, Pearl Harbor had united the nation with a fierce resolve for total victory. Inside the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, ambitious officers pushed for even more expansion. They drew up plans to isolate Australia by seizing New Guinea and the island chains in the Coral Sea. Another daring plan targeted Midway, a tiny but crucial outpost. The thinking was to capture Midway and use it as bait to lure the remaining American carriers into a final, decisive battle that would annihilate them for good. The strategy was simple: strike fast, grab as much territory as possible, build an impenetrable defensive ring, and force a demoralized America to the negotiating table. But beneath this glittering surface of success, Japan's war machine had deep, structural weaknesses. Its pilots and sailors were among the best in the world, but its industrial base was comparatively small. Japan simply couldn't replace its low-skilled personnel and complex machines like aircraft carriers at the rate a long war would demand. Its supply lines were stretched dangerously thin across the vast Pacific, making logistics a nightmare. Yet, in the triumphant spring of 1942, these uncomfortable truths were often ignored. The illusion of invincibility was just too powerful to let go. The first crack in that illusion appeared in May 1942, at the Battle of the Coral Sea. On paper, Japan scored a tactical victory, sinking more tonnage than it lost. But strategically, it was a setback. The invasion of Port Moresby in New Guinea was thwarted, halting the push to isolate Australia. More importantly, the battle proved something vital. The American carriers, the ones that had been conveniently absent from Pearl Harbor, were very much in the fight, and were ready to go toe-to-toe with the Japanese Navy. Then came June 1942, the Battle of Midway. This was the moment the tide of the Pacific War turned decisively and catastrophically for Japan. In a single, devastating engagement, 4 of Japan's frontline aircraft carriers, the Vera ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor, were sent to the bottom of the ocean. With them died hundreds of Japan's most elite and irreplaceable naval aviators. The offensive spearhead of the empire was shattered. The unstoppable momentum came to a sudden, grinding halt. These defeats forced Japan onto the defensive far sooner than anyone in its leadership had ever imagined. The full, brutal reality of their overreach became painfully clear just 2 months later, in August 1942. U.S. Marines landed on a remote, jungle-covered island called Guadalcanal. This marked the beginning of America's first major offensive and triggered a brutal 6-month campaign of attrition on land, at sea, and in the air. The struggle for Guadalcanal would bleed Japan's remaining resources dry, exposing the fatal flaws in its grand strategy. Looking back, historians agree that Japan's early war euphoria was a double-edged sword. It fueled the incredible victories of the first 6 months, but it also bred a dangerous arrogance. It led Japan's leaders to underestimate their enemy, overextend their forces, and pursue goals that were ultimately unsustainable. The very confidence that brought them so much success became the seed of their downfall. The attack on Pearl Harbor had indeed awakened a sleeping giant, and instead of deterring the United States, it ignited a fire of determination that Japan was completely unprepared to face. By the end of 1942, the momentum that Japan thought was its own had completely reversed, setting the stage for a long, bloody, and desperate retreat across the Pacific. We're talking about the Battle of Midway, a name synonymous with turning points. But what often gets overlooked is how this single battle sent shockwaves through Japan's leadership, fundamentally altering how they saw the war and their own chances of winning it. Before June 1942, Japan was riding high. From Pearl Harbor onwards, its naval forces had seemed unstoppable, an invincible force sweeping across the Pacific. The leadership was confident, even arrogant, believing that their superior training, fighting spirit, and bold tactics could secure a vast empire and force the United States to the negotiating table. But then came Midway. In just one devastating day, the illusion of invincibility was annihilated. The loss was catastrophic. Japan lost 4 of its most powerful fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These weren't just ships. They were the very heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy's offensive power. Think about it. The U.S. Naval Institute and the National World War II Museum have detailed this extensively. It wasn't just the steel hulls that sank to the bottom of the Pacific. It was the irreplaceable core of Japan's elite naval aviation force. Thousands of highly skilled pilots, navigators, and mechanicsmen who had spent years honing their craft and had invaluable combat experience were wiped out. The United States, by contrast, lost 1 carrier, the USS Yorktown. It was a painful blow, for sure, but America's burgeoning industrial might could replace a ship. Japan could not replace a generation of its best naval aviators. This is where the psychological shock truly set in. For the first time, Japanese officers, who believed they held a qualitative edge over the Americans, were forced to confront a brutal reality. The U.S. Navy wasn't just some sleeping giant. It was awake, resilient, and tactically brilliant. The battle exposed Japan's own critical weaknesses: flawed strategic planning, vulnerability to intelligence thanks to American code-breaking, the dangerous assumption that sheer willpower could overcome a massive industrial disadvantage. What's fascinating is what happened next. Publicly, the Japanese government kept the disaster under wraps. Civilians were fed stories of a great victory to maintain morale. But behind closed doors, within the military's highest echelons, a sense of confusion and disorientation took hold. Post-war documents reveal a command structure in disarray. The implications were clear. Japan's ability to launch large-scale offensive operations was gone. The Navy's striking power was crippled. So, did Japan switch to a purely defensive strategy? Logically, they should have, but they didn't. This is one of the most crucial and paradoxical outcomes of Midway. As historians point out, Japan entered a strange new phase. Strategically, they were forced onto the defensive, but operationally, they remained stubbornly aggressive. The High Command couldn't bring themselves to fully abandon their offensive ambitions. They desperately clung to the hope that one more bold, decisive battle could somehow reverse their fortunes before America's industrial power became truly overwhelming. This created an incredibly unstable situation. On one hand, they knew they couldn't afford another disaster like Midway. On the other, they feared that just sitting back and defending their newly conquered territories would be a slow, certain death, giving the U.S. all the time it needed to build an unstoppable war machine. This desperate mindset led to a series of high-risk gambles. They were trying to fight an offensive war with a defensive hand, a strategy that was doomed from the start. The shock of Midway also poisoned relationships within the Japanese command. The long-simmering rivalry between the Army and the Navy exploded. Each branch blamed the other for the defeat, pointing fingers over flawed plans and a lack of support. Within the Navy itself, factions began to form. One group argued for immediate, dramatic action to regain prestige and initiative, no matter the cost. Another, more cautious group, who had warned about overstretching Japan's resources from the beginning, found their voices drowned out by the calls for desperate glory. Meanwhile, the United States viewed Midway through a completely different lens. For American naval planners, this was at the moment the initiative had irrevocably shifted. With Japan's carrier fleet cut in half, the U.S. was no longer on the back foot. The victory validated everything. Their code-breaking efforts, their carrier tactics, their pilot training. It also electrified the American public, creating a powerful belief that victory in the Pacific was not just possible, but inevitable. Caught between internal chaos and a newly confident enemy, Japan's leadership made another fateful decision. They decided to counter the inevitable American push by reinforcing their defensive perimeter, particularly in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. This was a plan born from an outdated assumption, the belief that Japan could still control the pace and location of the next major battle. But Midway had already taken that power away from them. The U.S. was no longer reacting. It was preparing to launch a massive, sustained counteroffensive powered by an industrial engine that Japan couldn't even dream of matching. So, Midway wasn't just the high-water mark of Japanese expansion. It was the beginning of a long, painful strategic unraveling. The defeat forced Japan into a reactive posture it was ill-equipped to handle, exposing the deep-seated flaws in its military system. But perhaps the most profound impact was psychological. It drove the leadership to instead of consolidating their gains and preparing for a long, grilling defensive war, their only realistic option, they doubled down on risky, ambitious operations that their weakened forces could no longer sustain. And this unstable cocktail of shock, denial, and desperate ambition led directly to Japan's next great misstep. It set the stage for one of the most brutal and attritional campaigns of the entire Pacific War. The fight for a remote, jungle-covered island that neither side had paid much attention to before. An island called Guadalcanal. The struggle for Guadalcanal became the inevitable, bloody consequence of the strategic confusion and desperation that began in the waters around Midway. In mid-1942, as Japanese construction crews leveled the ground on a remote island called Guadalcanal, few in Tokyo's Imperial General Headquarters could have predicted the nightmare that was about to unfold. This seemingly insignificant speck in the Solomon Islands was about to become the epicenter of one of the most brutal and decisive campaigns of the Pacific War. For Japan, it was a secondary concern. A simple stepping stone in a grand defensive perimeter designed to protect its vast new empire. But this modest assessment would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. Records from Japan's Defense Ministry archives showed just how low Guadalcanal ranked on the list of priorities. The island had no real infrastructure and was far from the main theaters of war. Planners saw it as a useful, but not critical, logistical node. The idea was simple: build an airfield, station a small garrison, and use it to project air power over the Coral Sea, disrupting Allied convoys heading to Australia. It seemed like a straightforward, low-risk move, but Japan had fundamentally misread the board. For the Americans, that airfield, later named Henderson Field, was an immediate, existential threat. It wasn't just a tactical convenience. It was a dagger pointed at the vital sea lanes connecting the United States to Australia. These routes were the lifeline for future Allied offensives. Top U.S. commanders, like Admiral King and General Van Dagrift, knew they couldn't let Japan finish it. The moment Japanese engineers broke ground, Guadalcanal became a strategic flashpoint. The U.S. Joint Chiefs quickly approved Operation Watchtower, the first major American offensive of the entire war, with one clear goal: seize the island before it was too late. Japanese leadership, however, was caught completely off guard by this aggressive response. Still reeling from the shock of their defeat at Midway, they wrongly assumed the United States would stay on the defensive for months to come. This fatal assumption meant Guadalcanal was left with only a light defense, mostly construction workers, and a small security detail. No one seriously considered the possibility of an imminent invasion. This massive miscalculation stemmed from deep-rooted problems within Japan's war machine. First, the Imperial Navy and Army were notoriously uncooperative. The Navy was focused on securing sea lanes and bases for its carriers, while the Army was bogged down in the grueling New Guinea campaign. Guadalcanal fell right in the gap between their priorities, important enough for an airstrip, but not important enough for either branch to commit serious resources for its defense. Responsibility was ambiguous, and planning was fatally delayed. Second, Japanese intelligence in mid-1942 was dangerously overconfident. Even after Midway, many officers clung to the belief that the U.S. lacked the will and capability to launch a major amphibious assault so soon. Their intelligence reports consistently underestimated how quickly the Americans could plan and execute such an operation. They believed they had time. They were wrong. So when U.S. Marines stormed the beaches of Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, they found an enemy utterly unprepared. The Americans seized the nearly completed airfield with minimal resistance, immediately turning Japan's strategic asset into their own. This swift action kicked off a brutal 6-month slugging match that neither side had truly wanted, but both now knew they had to win. Japan's initial reaction shows just how badly they had misjudged the situation. At first, Tokyo dismissed the American landing as a small enemy raid, something that could be easily swatted away by nearby units. But as reports of fierce fighting and massive U.S. reinforcements poured in, the horrifying reality began to sink in. Guadalcanal was not a minor outpost. It was now a decisive battleground, a critical link in their defensive chain that was on the verge of snapping. What followed was a desperate, panicked scramble. Japan threw thousands of troops onto the island in a frantic attempt to retake the airfield. But because they had never planned for a major battle there, the logistical support simply didn't exist. Supplies were scarce. Reinforcements arrived piecemeal, and the famous Tokyo Express, fast destroyer runs under the cover of darkness, couldn't deliver enough food, ammunition, or heavy equipment to sustain the fight. The Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal were left to starve, victims of a strategic blunder made months earlier in Tokyo. Historians often point to Guadalcanal as the turning point of the Pacific War, the moment Japan was forced from offense to defense. But this wasn't a strategic choice. It was the inevitable consequence of a series of cascading errors. The island became a crucible where Japanese overconfidence, logistical weakness, and poor inter-service cooperation collided with devastating force. The fall of Guadalcanal didn't begin when the first American Marines set foot on its shores. It began in the minds of Japanese planners who dismissed it as an afterthought. This small, remote island, once considered a minor piece on the board, became the graveyard of Japan's offensive ambitions and changed the course of the war forever. August 7, 1942. The humid, dense jungles of a remote island called Guadalcanal are about to become the epicenter of the Pacific War. In the early morning mist, an armada of American warships appears on the horizon, a sight that'll shatter every assumption held by the Japanese high command. This wasn't just another battle. It was a thunderclap that announced America was no longer on the defensive. It was an offensive so bold, so audacious, that even many within the U.S. military questioned if they were ready. This is the story of how the United States struck back with shocking speed, catching Japan completely by surprise and changing the course of the war. Just weeks earlier, the Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Midway. But in Tokyo, the prevailing wisdom was that this loss, while significant, had bought them time. Japanese intelligence was confident that the United States, reeling from its own losses and facing immense logistical hurdles, would need at least a year to muster a meaningful counterattack. They saw America as a powerful but slow-moving giant, one that needed months to regroup, rebuild, and plan. This belief was rooted in a long-standing underestimation of America's ability to project power across the vast Pacific. They thought they had a window of opportunity to consolidate their gains and fortify their new defensive perimeter. This assumption would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. In Washington, a different conversation was happening. Men like Admiral Ernest King, the fiery and aggressive chief of naval operations, saw Midway not as a moment to breathe, but as a chance to seize the initiative. They knew about the unfinished Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal. If it became operational, it would sever the vital supply lines between the United States and Australia, effectively isolating a key ally and crippling any future Allied operations in the South Pacific. The American leadership understood a chilling reality. Every day they waited, Japan's fortress grew stronger. Hesitation was not an option. And so, in a whirlwind of activity, Operation Watchtower was born. The plan to invade Guadalcanal was conceived, approved, and launched in a breathtaking 6 weeks. To put that into perspective, planning for major amphibious operations often took many months. The haste was so extreme that the 19,000 Marines of the 1st Marine Division, who would lead the assault, had trained for combat, but not specifically for the brutal, close-quarters jungle warfare that awaited them. The entire logistical chain was stretched to its absolute limit. Ships were pulled from other duties, supplies were hastily gathered, and a massive force was assembled against all odds. It was a monumental gamble, driven by the conviction that speed was their greatest weapon. The sheer scale of the invasion was stunning. When the American fleet arrived, the Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were mostly construction workers and a small security detail. Their job was to build an airstrip, not fight off a full-scale invasion. Initial reports sent back to their headquarters in Rabaul were filled with confusion and disbelief. The Japanese commanders on the ground initially thought they were dealing with a small reconnaissance raid, not the largest amphibious assault since World War I. It took a full day for the reality to sink in. The Americans were here, and they were here in force. Historian Ian W. Toll calls the Guadalcanal landing one of the great strategic surprises of the entire war. And it's easy to see why. The shock wasn't just about the timing, it was about the psychology. The Japanese military had cultivated a narrative, both for themselves and for their people, of American timidity. They genuinely believed the U.S. lacked the will to launch such a daring offensive so soon after the devastating losses of early 1942. This propaganda-fueled belief blinded them to the possibility of a swift American counterpunch. As a result, they had no adequate defenses in place and no rapid response plan ready to go. The Americans, capitalizing on this surprise, moved with ruthless efficiency. The 1st Marine Division stormed the beaches and, with minimal initial resistance, captured the nearly completed airfield. They immediately set to work finishing it, renaming it Henderson Field in honor of a pilot lost at Midway. This single act gave the U.S. an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the heart of enemy territory. From Henderson Field, American planes could now strike Japanese supply lines and challenge their air superiority in the region. The speed of the landing and the even faster completion of the airfield put Japan on the back foot, a position from which they would struggle to recover. Back in Tokyo, the news from Guadalcanal was met with utter disbelief, which quickly turned to anger and frantic confusion. How could an invasion of this magnitude happen without a single piece of credible intelligence? Japan's spy network had failed completely. The shockwaves from this failure ripped through the high command, deepening the already existing rivalries between the Imperial Army and Navy, as each branch blamed the other for the disaster. As Japan scrambled to react, they found themselves consistently a step behind. Their initial counterattacks were disjointed and tragically inadequate. They sent in small groups of soldiers on destroyers in nighttime runs, a tactic that became known as the Tokyo Express. But these troops were often exhausted, poorly supplied, and completely unaware of the true strength of the American forces they were facing. By seizing the initiative so decisively, the United States had forced Japan into a reactive war, a type of conflict their doctrine and mindset were ill-equipped to handle. They were used to being the aggressor, setting the tempo. Now, They were dancing to America's tune. Guadalcanal was more than just a battle for an island. It was the first true test of American resolve in the Pacific theater. It proved that the industrial might of the United States could be translated into swift, decisive military action. It showed that American soldiers could not only fight, but adapt and win in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The campaign marked the beginning of the end for Japanese expansion. From this point forward, the tide of the war would flow in only one direction. The landing on August 7, 1942, was a clear and unambiguous message to the Empire of Japan. The era of easy victories was over. The time for defense had passed. America was on the attack, and it would not stop until the war was won. The surprise, the speed, and the sheer audacity of the Guadalcanal campaign reshaped the entire strategic landscape of the Pacific, signaling a fundamental shift in the balance of power and setting the stage for the long, bloody road to Tokyo. In the vast, sprawling conflict of the Pacific War, one decision stands out as a fatal misjudgment, a strategic error so profound it would change the course of history. This was Japan's unwavering, almost fanatical, determination to retake Guadalcanal. In August 1942, when American Marines unexpectedly landed on this obscure island, the Japanese High Command faced a choice. They could have accepted a minor setback and focused on consolidating their enormous empire. Instead, they declared a total, relentless effort to reclaim the island at any cost. This single phrase, found in their own operational orders, perfectly captures the psychological and cultural resistance to retreat that would doom their efforts and bleed their empire dry. To truly grasp the scale of this blunder, we need to look at Japan's position in mid-1942. Yes, they had achieved stunning early victories, but their strategic perimeter was stretched dangerously thin. Supply lines snaked across thousands of miles of ocean, increasingly threatened by Allied submarines and aircraft. Japan's industrial might, already dwarfed by America's, was groaning under the strain of supporting fronts from Burma to the remote Aleutian Islands. Fuel was becoming scarce, aircraft production was lagging, and they were struggling to replace trained troops. These were glaring weaknesses, but the High Command often chose to ignore them. So, when the Americans landed on Guadalcanal and captured the nearly finished airfield, Japan didn't see it as an isolated problem. They saw it as a dagger aimed at the heart of their defensive line in the South Pacific. The psychological blow was immense. Guadalcanal itself was initially unimportant, but the idea of losing it to the enemy was a symbolic stain they could not bear. Allowing the U.S. to establish a base so close to their key stronghold at Rabaul was simply intolerable. As historians like Richard B. Frank have pointed out, Japan's reaction wasn't driven by cold, hard strategy. It was fueled by cultural imperatives deeply woven into their military fabric. For the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, retreat wasn't just a bad option. It was a mark of dishonor. Their military doctrine, steeped in the warrior code of Bushido, prized defensive spirit and unwavering will above all else. Victory, they believed, was a matter of spiritual strength, not logistical superiority. This mindset led many commanders to dismiss American forces as soft and fragile, believing they lacked the spiritual resilience of the Japanese soldier. So, instead of even considering a strategic withdrawal, Japan's leaders doubled down, convinced they could crush the Americans. They framed the campaign as a test of national will, predicting that a few vigorous, decisive attacks would send the enemy running from the island's brutal jungle conditions. This expectation was about to collide head-on with a very different reality. Logistically, the mission was a nightmare from the start. Japan simply couldn't sustain a prolonged battle so far from its main supply hubs. Their solution, the famous Tokyo Express, involved fast nighttime runs by destroyers to deliver troops. But these warships weren't designed for transport. They could bring in men, but not nearly enough food, ammunition, heavy artillery, or medical supplies. Meanwhile, larger, slower transport ships were sitting ducks for American planes flying from the captured Henderson Field. As a result, Japanese soldiers often arrived on Guadalcanal already exhausted, starving, and ill-equipped for the grueling fight ahead. To make matters worse, Japan catastrophically underestimated the American force. Early intelligence reports claimed it was just a small raiding party. Even as more accurate information started to filter in, Tokyo stubbornly clung to the belief that a few spirited assaults would be enough. This led to a series of doomed attacks at places that would become legendary for their bloodshed: the Ilu River, Edson's Ridge, and the battles along the Mataniko River. In each one, Japanese troops charged with incredible bravery, only to be cut down by overwhelming American firepower, well-prepared defenses, and a logistical chain that never broke. The human cost of this stubborn determination was beyond catastrophic. Thousands of Japanese soldiers died, not just in combat, but from starvation, malaria, dysentery, and sheer exhaustion. Diaries recovered later tell a horrifying story of men too weak to stand, units reduced to skeletal shadows, and officers struggling to hold their formations together as their soldiers literally wasted away. Yet the army kept sending more reinforcements, feeding them into the meat grinder, only to see them consumed by the relentless American defense and the unforgiving jungle. Strategically, this obsession with Guadalcanal became a black hole, sucking in Japan's most precious resources. It drained their reserves of experienced infantry and, crucially, their irreplaceable naval air crews. The veteran pilots, already a scarce commodity after the Battle of Midway, were lost at a rate Japan's training programs couldn't possibly match. The series of vicious naval battles fought in the waters around the island, known as Iron Bedham's Sound, crippled the combined fleet. Carriers and battleships burned through critically low fuel reserves. Every ship lost, every plane shot down, and every pilot killed on Guadalcanal weakened Japan's ability to defend the rest of its vast empire. While Japan was bleeding itself white, the United States was doing the exact opposite. With its immense industrial power, America was transforming Guadalcanal from a fragile foothold into a formidable fortress. A steady stream of fresh troops, supplies, ammunition, and heavy equipment poured onto the island. American control of Henderson Field gave them complete air superiority during the day, and their navy grew stronger and more confident in challenging Japan's nighttime reinforcement runs. The writing was on the wall for anyone willing to read it. Guadalcanal was unwinnable. Yet, even in the face of this overwhelming evidence, Japan's high command couldn't bring themselves to accept defeat. The internal debates grew furious. Leaders like Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto argued that abandoning the island would shatter morale and give up vital strategic ground. Others warned that continuing the fight would leave the rest of the empire defenseless. But cultural pride, a deep-seated fear of humiliation, and a systemic denial of reality locked Japan into its losing strategy. By late 1942, it was painfully obvious that Japan had The campaign was bleeding the empire dry of men, ships, and planes. And still, the orders from Tokyo were to attack, attack, and attack again. In the end, Japan's decision to retake Guadalcanal at any cost was more than just a military mistake. It was a fatal misjudgment born from a rigid culture, blinding overconfidence, and a complete failure to respect the unyielding laws of logistics. The cost proved to be everything. By early 1943, Japan was forced into a humiliating secret withdrawal, abandoning the island and the ghosts of tens of thousands of their men. This was the empire's first major strategic defeat on land, a turning point that marked the irreversible shift of momentum in the Pacific War. The tide had turned, and it had turned at Guadalcanal. To understand the Tokyo Express, you have to picture the situation in late 1942. The U.S. Marines have seized a vital airfield on Guadalcanal, now named Henderson Field. From this single airstrip, American planes dominate the daytime skies. For the Japanese, retaking this airfield is paramount, but getting troops and supplies onto the island is a death sentence for their slow, vulnerable transport ships. Their solution: use their fastest warships destroyers to make high-speed runs down the slot to Guadalcanal. Under the cover of night, these lightning-fast convoys, the Tokyo Express, seemed like a brilliant tactical move. Japanese destroyers were fast, well-armed, and their crews were masters of nighttime operations. For a few weeks, it seemed to work, ferrying thousands of fresh troops to the island to challenge the American defenders. But what looked clever on paper quickly fell apart in practice. The core problem was that destroyers are warships, not cargo haulers. They simply couldn't carry enough. Imagine trying to move house using only a sports car. You can make a lot of fast trips, but you can't bring the furniture. That's what Japan was facing. They could deliver soldiers, but not the immense volume of food, ammunition, medical supplies, and heavy equipment needed to sustain them in a prolonged fight. Studies later showed that Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were receiving as little as 10 to 20% of the supplies they actually needed. This wasn't a minor shortfall. It was a catastrophic failure that crippled them from the start. The consequences for the Japanese soldiers on the ground were horrific. They arrived on Guadalcanal with meager rations, which quickly ran out. Diaries recovered after the war paint a grim picture of men reduced to eating leaves, insects, and even tree bark to survive. Starvation and malnutrition became as deadly as American bullets. Entire regiments were weakened before they even saw combat. On top of DTDs like malaria and dysentery tore through the ranks, unchecked by a lack of medicine. The island earned a terrifying new name among the Japanese soldiers who fought there, Starvation Island. The elite soldiers of the Imperial Army, men who prided themselves on their discipline and endurance, were being systematically broken not by enemy fire, but by logistical collapse. From a strategic perspective, the Tokyo Express was a slow-motion disaster for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Each high-speed run consumed enormous amounts of fuel, a resource Japan was desperately short of. Every trip to Guadalcanal was a drain on the precious reserves needed to power the rest of their fleet across the Pacific. Worse, it put their best warships and most experienced crews directly in harm's way, night after night. As the campaign wore on, the U.S. Navy grew more aggressive, intercepting the Express and sparking a series of ferocious nighttime naval battles in the waters of Ironbedham Sound. Each Japanese destroyer sunk was an irreplaceable loss. Japan's industry couldn't build them fast enough, and its training programs couldn't replace the veteran sailors lost with them. The Tokyo Express was literally burning through the heart and soul of the Japanese Navy, ship by ship, sailor by sailor. Now, let's contrast this with the American experience. While Japan was struggling to deliver a few tons of supplies a night, the United States was unleashing its industrial might. Protected by the air cover from Henderson Field, massive American transport ships could arrive during the day and unload staggering quantities of everything imaginable. We're talking bulldozers, heavy artillery, trucks, fuel drums, entire field hospitals, and mountains of ammunition crates. Thousands upon thousands of fresh troops, first more Marines, then entire Army divisions streamed onto the island. American engineers worked miracles, expanding the airfield, building new runways, and creating vast supply depots that dwarfed anything the Japanese could muster. The logistical gap between the two sides wasn't just a gap, it was a chasm, and it widened with every passing week. For the American troops, this meant their strength grew daily. They were better fed, better equipped, and better cared for. When units became exhausted, they were rotated out and replaced with fresh ones. Wounded soldiers were treated in well-stocked hospitals. Artillery batteries grew larger and more numerous, providing devastating fire support. Guadalcanal was transformed from a precarious beachhead into a heavily armed fortress. This wasn't just a military victory, it was an industrial one. Henderson Field became a symbol not just of air superiority, but of the overwhelming manufacturing power that backed the entire American war effort. The fight for Guadalcanal became a contest between a nation fighting on a shoestring and a nation with seemingly limitless resources. The Japanese high command saw the writing on the wall. They knew the situation was disastrous, but they felt trapped. Retreating from Guadalcanal would be a devastating blow to national morale and a major strategic concession. So they ordered the fight to continue, forcing the Navy to keep running the doomed Tokyo Express. In their desperation, they tried other methods. They started packing supplies into sealed drums and dropping them from destroyers offshore, hoping the currents would wash them ashore to their troops. It was a miserable failure. Many drums sank, others were destroyed by American aircraft, and some drifted right into American-held territory. The supplies that did make it were often spoiled or damaged. It was an unreliable, inefficient, and deeply demoralizing system for the starving men waiting on the beaches. You can see the human cost in the reports from Japanese commanders. They noted that their soldiers were often too weak to even carry their rifles, too exhausted to march, and too sick to mount a coordinated attack. The pride and fighting spirit of the Imperial Army were being ground down by hunger and disease. The Tokyo Express hadn't just failed to supply them, it had delivered them to a slow, agonizing defeat. This wasn't a failure of courage. The Japanese sailors who ran the express and the soldiers who fought on the island displayed incredible bravery. It was a failure of systems, of industrial capacity, of a strategy that demanded more than a nation could possibly give. In the end, the story of the Tokyo Express is a tragic one. It was a valiant effort, a testament to the skill and determination of the Imperial Japanese Navy. But it was seamanship applied to an impossible logistical problem. Japan simply did not have the shipping, the industrial base, or the resources to sustain a major campaign on an island dominated by an enemy with total air superiority and a global supply chain. The Express managed to prolong the agony on Guadalcanal, but it could never change the outcome. It was, like so much of Japan's strategy for the island, a case of too little, too late. The battle for Guadalcanal wasn't just won by Marines and pilots. It was won by mechanics, engineers, and the thousands of workers in American factories half a world away. Between August and November of 1942, a patch of ocean in the South Pacific became the most violent and contested waters on Earth. The sea around Guadalcanal, soon to be grimly nicknamed Sound, was where the Imperial Japanese Navy and the United States Navy would collide in a series of battles so brutal and decisive they would forever alter the course of the Pacific War. In just a few short months, names like Savo Island, the Eastern Solomons, Cape Esperance, and Santa Cruz would be etched into naval history. These weren't just isolated clashes, they were a relentless meat grinder that consumed ships, planes, and most importantly, irreplaceable men. And when the smoke finally cleared, the balance of naval power in the Pacific had been fundamentally and irreversibly broken. Japan's maritime dominance was beginning to crumble. The campaign began with a horrifying shock for the United States. On the night of August 8th, a force of Japanese cruisers under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa slipped through the darkness and unleashed a perfectly executed surprise attack. In the Battle of Savo Island, 4 Allied heavy cruisers were sent to the bottom of the sea in minutes. It was one of the most crushing defeats in the history of the U.S. Navy. The Japanese had proven their mastery of night combat, a skill honed through years of intense training and superior optics. Yet, in this moment of overwhelming tactical victory, a critical mistake was made. Instead of pressing his attack against the vulnerable American transport ships anchored offshore, Mikawa chose to withdraw. Those transports were loaded with the vital supplies and equipment needed by the U.S. Marines, who had just landed and seized the crucial airstrip, Henderson Field. The survival of those transports was a stroke of luck that would prove to be absolutely pivotal. With the battle lines drawn, Japan was determined to use its naval might to isolate Guadalcanal and annihilate the American foothold. But as the conflict escalated into full-blown carrier battles, a fatal weakness in Japan, S-war machine began to bleed through. The quality and quantity of its naval aviators, at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August, and again at the Battle of Santa Cruz in October. Japanese carrier planes inflicted severe damage on the American fleet. They even managed to sink the carrier USS Hornet, but these victories came at a staggering price. Japan lost a huge number of its elite pre-war carrier pilots. These were the best of the best. The same aviators who had executed the stunning attack on Pearl Harbor and swept across the Pacific in the opening months of the war. Each one of these pilots was the product of an incredibly selective and rigorous training program that could take 5 to 7 years to complete. When they were killed, they were, for all practical purposes, irreplaceable. The United States, in stark contrast, was just beginning to fire up its immense industrial and training capacity. American flight schools were starting to churn out hundreds of new pilots every single month, a scale of replacement that Japan simply could not imagine, let alone match. The impact wasn't felt overnight, but by the end of 1942, this growing disparity in trained manpower was already shaping the outcome of every single engagement. the war on the surface was just as savage. The dark waters of Iron Beatum Sound truly earned their name as cruisers and destroyers from both sides blasted away at each other at point range, often lit only by the eerie glow of searchlights and the blinding flash of naval guns. In these chaotic night brawls, the U.S. Navy initially struggled against the more experienced Japanese, but they learned and adapted with remarkable speed. The introduction of new technology, particularly SG surface search radar, began to systematically dismantle Japan's night fighting advantage. Suddenly, American ships could see in the dark. Veteran Japanese destroyers and cruisers, many commanded by officers who had been fighting since the war in China, were lost in battles like Cape Esperance and the First and Second Naval Battles of Guadalcanal. For Japan, these losses were catastrophic. Destroyers were the workhorses of the fleet, the lifeline of the Tokyo Express, the nightly supply runs that kept the Japanese army on the island from starving. As more and more of these vital ships were sunk, damaged, or simply worn out from constant operations, Japan's ability to reinforce its troops on Guadalcanal withered away. Each lost destroyer wasn't just a tactical setback. It was a strategic wound that couldn't be healed. Japan's shipbuilding industry lacked the capacity to replace modern warships at the frantic pace the war now demanded. The carrier battles mirrored this grim reality. The Japanese Navy still fought with incredible ferocity and skill. They still inflicted heavy casualties, but every loss they suffered cut deeper than the last. The sinking of the battleship Hiei during the naval battle of Guadalcanal was a major shock, the first Japanese battleship lost in the entire war. Her sister ship, Kirishima, followed her to the bottom shortly after. Even more devastating was the loss of dozens more of Japan's best remaining pilots in these same fights, along with a host of cruisers and destroyers. By November 1942, the tide had turned. The sheer power of American industry was reshaping the battlefield in real time. When a U.S. ship was damaged, it could often be repaired and returned to the fight within months. Damaged Japanese ships, however, might languish in shipyards for a year or more, if they could be repaired at all. Every pilot Japan lost was the end of years of investment. Every destroyer sunk was a gap in its logistics and escort capabilities that could never be filled. The cumulative effect was undeniable. The Imperial Japanese Navy was bleeding out, vessel by vessel, pilot by pilot, when the final, climactic phase of the naval battle of Guadalcanal concluded. The strategic initiative had shifted for good. The Japanese Navy, once the most feared naval force in the Pacific, was now finding itself outmanned, outproduced, and increasingly out. The U.S. Navy, though battered and bloodied, emerged from the crucible of Guadalcanal stronger, more experienced, and backed by an industrial machine that was just getting started. Guadalcanal was the turning point of the Pacific War. It wasn't one single, glorious battle, but a brutal, relentless war of attrition. It was a campaign where Japan was forced to trade its irreplaceable corvettes veteran pilots, its skilled sailors, its finest warships for time it did not have. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted, and it would never shift back. By late 1942, the fight for Guadalcanal had transformed. For the Japanese soldiers on the island, the enemy was no longer just the American Marines. It was starvation. It was disease. What started as a determined push to retake the island had devolved into a slow, grinding humanitarian catastrophe. A collapse driven not by enemy bullets, but by the complete and utter failure of Japan's logistical system. While the U.S. military grew stronger with each passing day, Japanese soldiers found themselves trapped in a downward spiral that no amount of courage or discipline could ever reverse. Official Japanese Army records paint a grim picture. By November 1942, over 60% of Japanese troops on Guadalcanal were suffering from severe malnutrition. Thousands were too weak to even carry their rifles, let alone stand and fight. In Somme Unix, the death toll from starvation and illness far outpaced combat casualties. Soldiers who had once marched proudly for the emperor were now reduced to scouring the jungle for insects, roots, and palm bark. Many were forced to boil leaves, a desperate attempt to trick their empty stomachs into feeling full. The island, which they had come to conquer, was now slowly consuming them. The crisis stemmed from a fatal flaw in Japan's logistical strategy. The Imperial High Command had gambled everything on the Tokyo Express, a high-sped but very limited supply chain that relied on destroyers. They believed these fast ships could sustain the offensive just long enough to secure a quick victory. But this gamble failed spectacularly. As the U.S. tightened its grip on Henderson Field, American aircraft began to dominate the skies and the surrounding waters. Japanese transport ships couldn't get near Guadalcanal during the day without being bombed and sunk. The destroyers, while fast, were a poor substitute. They couldn't carry heavy equipment, large amounts of ammunition, or, most critically, enough food. On a good night, they delivered a tiny fraction of what the Army needed, often less than 1/10 of the daily requirement. As supplies dwindled, the Japanese command grew desperate. They tried using submarines to transport rice, but their cargo capacity was minuscule. They filled cargo drums with food and floated them offshore, hoping the currents would carry them to their beaches. Most either sank or drifted straight into American hands. Attempts to airdrop supplies were also a failure, thwarted by American fighters, anti-aircraft guns, and poor coordination. Japan's lifeline to Guadalcanal had been severed. Meanwhile, on the other side of the line, the U.S. supply system was a picture of industrial efficiency. Large cargo ships, escorted by warships and protected by air cover from Henderson Field, made regular, predictable deliveries. Food, artillery shells, medical supplies, and fresh reinforcements flowed onto the island in a steady stream. American soldiers were rotated in and out of the front lines, received proper rations, and were treated for the very same diseases, malaria and dysentery, that were devastating the Japanese. Even in the harsh jungle of Guadalcanal, the U.S. was able to maintain its units at high combat readiness. The difference this made on the battlefield was stark and brutal. Japanese attacks, like the ferocious but ultimately doomed assaults on Henderson Field in September and October, were increasingly carried out by men who were too weak to even march properly, let alone fight. Diaries recovered from fallen Japanese soldiers after the war reveal heartbreaking details. Soldiers collapsing from exhaustion during an attack because they hadn't eaten in days. Officers rationing a single handful of rice among dozens of their men. Medical units, with no supplies of their own, completely overwhelmed by cases of beriberi, malaria, and dysentery. Some soldiers wrote of hallucinating food, while others recorded that constant hunger made it impossible to think clearly. For the Japanese troops, the campaign became a living nightmare. Malnutrition destroyed their immune systems, allowing disease to spread like wildfire. The jungle, which American troops were gradually learning to adapt to, remained a hostile and unforgiving enemy for Japanese units who lacked proper supplies and medical care. Survivors later described the constant smell of death that hung over their encampments as men succumbed one by one to starvation. It was a silent, invisible killer that stalked their ranks day and night. Commanders back on Rabaul and in Tokyo were aware of the disaster unfolding on Guadalcanal, but they were paralyzed by indecision. The Imperial Japanese Army had a deeply ingrained culture of never retreating. This, combined with a fierce inter-service rivalry with the Navy, delayed any decision to withdraw. Each service blamed the other for the failure, and no one wanted to be the first to admit defeat. By the time Japan finally chose evacuation in December 1942, it was too late. The army on Guadalcanal was no longer capable of any offensive action. The once-proud infantry divisions had been hollowed out, reduced to mere shells of their former strength, with many units operating at a tiny fraction of their original manpower. In stark contrast, American forces just kept growing stronger. Fresh Marine and Army divisions arrived on the island, bringing new energy and firepower. The American artillery positions expanded, creating an almost impenetrable ring of fire around their perimeter. They even built additional airstrips, cementing their total air superiority. A psychological chasm opened up between the two sides. American morale soared as supplies flowed in, while Japanese morale collapsed under the crushing weight of hunger and hopelessness. This immense logistical imbalance transformed Guadalcanal. It was no longer a contest of tactics or bravery. It had become a brutal test of endurance. And it was a test that Japan, with its broken supply line, had no hope of passing. Starvation became the silent weapon that ultimately determined the fate of the entire campaign. No amount of courage, no brilliant tactical maneuver could ever compensate for an empty stomach. The battle had been decided not on the front lines, but in the cargo holds of ships that never arrived. When Japan finally began Operation Kathori evacuation of Guadalcanal in early 1943, they weren't withdrawing a beaten army. They were rescuing the dying remnants of one. Many of the soldiers who were evacuated were skeletal, delirious, and barely alive. They were ghosts of the men who had landed just months earlier. In the end, starvation and disease inflicted far more casualties on the Japanese than American bullets ever did. Out of the approximately 31,000 Japanese troops sent to the island, over 20,000 would not leave it alive. The vast majority of those deaths were due to non-combat causes. The battle for Guadalcanal taught the world a brutal but essential lesson of modern warfare. Logistics, not just glory, decides who wins and who loses. For all the talk of fighting spirit and honor, it is the steady, unglamorous work of supply that sustains an army. At Guadalcanal, Japan's logistical collapse sealed its defeat long before the final shots were ever fired, marking a critical turning point in the Pacific War. By early 1943, a harsh reality settled over the Imperial Japanese High Command. After 6 brutal months of combat on a remote island in the South Pacific, the Guadalcanal campaign was lost. What had started as a confident push to expel a small American force had devolved into a nightmare of attrition. Japan's army and navy, battered at sea, decimated in the air, and starving on land, could no longer contest the American grip on Guadalcanal. The dream of a swift victory had evaporated, replaced by the grim necessity of survival. Faced with a complete logistical collapse and the impossibility of launching another offensive, Japan's leaders made a decision that would have been unthinkable just months prior. They would abandon the island. This decision gave birth to Operation K, a highly secretive and brilliantly executed evacuation plan that unfolded between January and February 1943. Unlike Japan's previous efforts, which were defined by aggressive, often reckless, attempts to reinforce their beleaguered troops, Operation K was a masterpiece of deception and precision. The objective was no longer to fight for Guadalcanal, but to rescue the survivors, the starving, disease-ridden remnants of what were once proud and formidable divisions, without tipping off the Americans. To achieve this, the Japanese orchestrated a complex series of diversionary air raids and naval feints, creating the illusion that they were gearing up for one last massive offensive. American intelligence, conditioned by months of observing the so-called Tokyo Express bringing in reinforcements, fell for the ruse. They saw the increased activity as a prelude to another major assault, failing to recognize it for what it truly was: the final, quiet admission of defeat. Between the 1st and 7th of February 1943, under the cloak of darkness, Japanese destroyers made a series of high-speed runs into the treacherous waters around Guadalcanal. These same agile warships, which had once ferried fresh troops and supplies to the island, were now on a mission of mercy. Instead of delivering men to the fight, they were there to pull them out. Over 3 harrowing nights, these rat transports, as the Americans called them, successfully evacuated more than 10,000 Japanese soldiers. From a tactical standpoint, Operation K was one of the most successful withdrawal operations of the entire war. Japanese planning, timing, deception, and naval skill had aligned perfectly to snatch thousands of men from the jaws of a closing trap. But the tactical brilliance of the operation masked a deep and profound human tragedy. The men who stumbled aboard those destroyers were not the fierce warriors who had landed on Guadalcanal months earlier, filled with confidence and imperial pride. They were skeletal figures, emaciated ghosts ravaged by months of starvation and tropical diseases. Many had lost over 1/3 of their body weight and were too weak to walk unassisted. Medical records from their arrival in Rabaul paint a horrifying picture. Thousands suffering from advanced stages of malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and severe malnutrition. For a significant number of these rescued soldiers, the evacuation came too late. Their bodies were too broken to recover, and they died shortly after reaching safety. Silent casualties of a campaign that had consumed everything. Operation K wasn't just the end of a single, bloody battle. It marked the symbolic end of Japan's grand strategic ambitions in the Pacific. Guadalcanal had been the first true test of strength on the ground between the United States and Japan following the pivotal Battle of Midway. Both nations understood that the outcome would dictate the future course of the war. Japan's defeat there shattered the myth of its invincibility, a myth that had powered its stunning series of victories across Asia and the Pacific. After Guadalcanal, the strategic initiative passed decisively and permanently to the United States. Furthermore, the failure on the island exposed fatal flaws at the heart of Japan's military doctrine. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had entered the war supremely confident that their superior fighting spirit, rigorous discipline, and aggressive tactics could overcome America's industrial and numerical advantages. Guadalcanal proved that belief to be a catastrophic miscalculation. It demonstrated, in the most brutal fashion, that courage and tactical skill were no match for a modern, industrialized war machine with robust logistics and seemingly inexhaustible supply lines. The island became a microcosm of the entire Pacific War, a contest between Japan's short-term tactical brilliance and America's overwhelming, long-term strategic power. Without the ability to sustain its forces and replace its losses, Japan was doomed to a war of attrition it could never win. The loss of Guadalcanal forced a fundamental shift in Japan's entire Pacific strategy. The era of bold expansionist offensives was over. From that point forward, Japan was on the defensive. It retreated, establishing new defensive lines across the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and later the Marianas, the Philippines, and Okinawa. But each new line was weaker than the last. Each battle cost Japan precious ships, aircraft, and irreplaceable veteran pilots and soldiers that its industry could not replenish. The once vast defensive perimeter that Japan had carved out in the early months of the war began to shrink, contracting steadily under relentless American pressure. Meanwhile, the United States, its war economy now running at full throttle, adopted an unforgiving operational tempo, fueled by industrial production on a scale the world had never seen. American forces began their island-hopping campaign. With every island captured, U.S. airfields crept closer and closer to the Japanese homeland, bringing their powerful B-29 bombers within striking range. The pattern established at Guadalcanal of Japan being overwhelmed and forced to withdraw, while American forces advanced with massive logistical support, became the defining rhythm of the rest of the war in the Pacific. In T-Slight Operation K was far more than a simple military retreat. It was the turning point of an era. The quiet evacuation of those thousands of starving soldiers signaled the collapse of Japan's ambition to dominate the Pacific. It revealed that the empire's strategic horizon had shrunk from one of conquest to one of mere survival. The same military that had once dreamed of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, stretching from India to Hawaii, was now fighting a desperate, delaying action, simply to postpone the inevitable defeat. For Japan's leaders, the decision to abandon Guadalcanal was both a pragmatic necessity and a bitter pill to swallow. They knew that clinging to the island would only lead to the meaningless sacrifice of more men, but they also knew that the world and history would see the withdrawal for what it was, a clear admission that Japan's offensive power had been broken. In the immediate aftermath, the Japanese public was fed a sanitized version of events. The withdrawal from Guadalcanal was presented as a strategic redeployment, a turning movement to consolidate forces for future battles. But within the highest echelons of the military and government, no one was fooled. They understood the devastating truth. Guadalcanal was the high-water mark of the Japanese Empire. It was the beginning of the end. From February 1943 onward, the trajectory of the war was set. Japan was locked into a long, bloody, and ultimately hopeless defensive struggle, and the United States, now fully mobilized and confident in its strength, would press forward, island by island, until the war finally reached the shores of Japan itself. The ghost ships of Operation K did more than carry defeated soldiers. They carried away the last remnants of a broken dream. In the vast, sprawling story of World War II, some moments stand out as true turning points, events so critical they altered the very course of history. In the Pacific, that moment wasn't a single battle, but a brutal, 6-month struggle on a remote, jungle-choked island called Guadalcanal. From August 1942 to February 1943, this campaign transformed a war dominated by Japanese momentum into a relentless Allied advance. It was here that Japan's seemingly unstoppable expansion finally hit a wall of steel, and the long, painful retreat back to Tokyo began. Before Guadalcanal, Japan's military machine was a force of nature. In the 6 months following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific with terrifying speed. Hong Kong, the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies all fell. The Japanese military believed they had shattered American morale and crippled the Allied ability to fight back. Their stunning victories fostered an aura of invincibility, a sense that Japan's destiny was to rule the Pacific, backed by superior tactics and an unbreakable warrior spirit. But Guadalcanal was about to shatter that illusion completely. On August 7, 1942, United States Marines stormed the beaches of Guadalcanal, launching the first major American offensive of the war. It was a risky, audacious move that caught the Japanese high command by surprise. They simply didn't believe the U.S. could mount such an operation so soon after the Battle of Midway. The catalyst for this invasion was a Japanese airfield under construction on the island. That strip of land, which would soon become world-famous as Henderson Field, was destined to become the fulcrum upon which the fate of the entire Pacific theater would turn. What followed was a grinding, nightmarish war of attrition. Savage battles raged on land, sea, and in the air, as both sides fought for control of the island, its vital airfield, and the surrounding sea lanes. But beneath the chaos of combat, a deeper struggle was taking place, a battle of strategic will and, most importantly, logistical capacity. Historians today almost universally agree on this point. Japan clung to Guadalcanal not because the island itself was strategically irreplaceable, but because admitting defeat was culturally and politically unthinkable for the empire. The Imperial Japanese army was trapped by its own propaganda and pride. Giving up territory they had conquered would undermine the very foundation of their warrior ideology. They couldn't reconcile their strategic limitations with their cultural expectations of victory at all costs. The Americans, however, viewed the battle through a completely different lens. For them, Guadalcanal was the first crucial stepping stone in a long-term counteroffensive. They understood that controlling Henderson Field would allow their bombers to sever Japan's supply lines to the South Pacific and, critically, protect the vital Allied lifeline to Australia. Washington also recognized the immense psychological impact of winning its first major land confrontation against the formidable Japanese army. This campaign quickly evolved into a brutal test of which nation could better sustain a prolonged high-intensity conflict far from home. And in this contest, America's industrial might proved to be the decisive factor. The naval battles fought in the waters around Guadalcanal, names like Savo Island, Cape Esperance, and the naval battle of Guadalcanal were among the most ferocious in naval history. Both sides suffered staggering losses in ships and men. But there was a key difference. Japan lost irreplaceable assets, veteran pilots, elite naval crews, and warships that its industry couldn't quickly replace. The United States, meanwhile, backed by factories running 24/7, could build new ships and planes faster than Japan could even repair its damaged ones. America could absorb the blows and keep fighting. Japan could not. On the island itself, the logistical disparity was even more stark and far more grim. Japanese soldiers, cut off from resupply, were ravaged by starvation and disease. Official Japanese army reports from late 1942 revealed a horrifying reality. Over 60% of their troops were suffering from severe malnutrition. They were literally starving to death in the jungle. In stark contrast, American forces, supported by air and naval dominance, were able to land tens of thousands of tons of food, ammunition, and fresh reinforcements. The U.S. was fighting a war of industrial production, while Japan was fighting a war of dwindling spirit. By the end of the campaign, the once feared Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were reduced to skeletal survivors, ghosts of their former selves. In February 1943, Japan executed Operation Kea, secret and skillfully conducted evacuation of their remaining troops. While it was a tactical success, it was an undeniable strategic admission of total defeat. Japan wasn't redeploying its forces. It was running away. The evacuation from Guadalcanal marked the precise moment Japan's war of expansion came to a definitive end. From that point on, Japan no longer dictated the tempo of the war. The empire was forced onto the defensive, fighting desperately to hold on to its gains. The battles that followed across New Georgia, Bougainville, the Marianas, the Philippines, and finally Okinawa, a series of bloody, foregone conclusions. Each one only served to highlight how strategically catastrophic the gamble at Guadalcanal had been. The significance of Guadalcanal doesn't lie in one single dramatic victory. It lies in the cumulative, crushing weight of 6 months of sustained, attritional warfare. The campaign mercilessly exposed Japan's fundamental inability to wage a modern, industrial war against a peer competitor. It showcased the power of integrated American operations, coordinating land, sea, and air forces into a unified, lethal machine. And most importantly, it proved to the Allies and to the world that the Japanese soldier could be beaten, and that the United States had the will and the power to reclaim the Pacific one bloody island at a time. Historians have summarized it perfectly. Guadalcanal shifted the entire arc of the Pacific War from one of Japanese expansion to one of Japanese exhaustion. It was a turning point, not because of some grand political declaration, but because it forced Japan to confront the harsh reality of its own limitations. By February 1943, history had been Japan's aura of invincibility was shattered. The United States had seized the initiative, and it would never let it go. The long road to Tokyo had begun, and the direction of the Second World War had been changed forever. Thanks for watching. And if you found this deep dive interesting, be sure to like and subscribe for more historical analysis.